Her daughter had 3 months to live. She had $3.47 to her name. The only treatment that could save her child cost more than she'd make in 10 lifetimes. Then she sat near a man worth $500 million on Flight 447 to Miami. What he did next will make you speechless. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to smash that subscribe button for more. Also, share your thoughts and let me know where you're watching from. Tomorrow's story is going to be just as epic, so don't miss out. Now, let's continue. The pre-dawn darkness of Chicago's O'Hare International Airport buzzed with the restless energy of delayed travelers, but Lucia Martinez barely noticed the chaos swirling around her as she clutched her boarding pass with trembling fingers, the thin paper already wrinkled from her nervous grip. At 28, she possessed the kind of natural beauty that turned heads even when she didn't want the attention, warm honey-colored skin that spoke of her Mexican heritage, expressive dark brown eyes that could convey 1,000 emotions without saying a word, and long, silky black hair that she'd pulled back into a simple ponytail because she couldn't afford the luxury of caring about her appearance today. Her petite frame, barely 5'4", was draped in her only decent outfit, a navy blue dress she'd bought from a thrift store 3 years ago for her sister's wedding, paired with scuffed black flats that had seen better days, and a thin cardigan that did little to ward off the airport's aggressive air conditioning. But it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was the weight of desperation pressing against her chest like a physical force, making each breath feel labored and insufficient. The boarding announcement for Flight 447 to Miami crackled through the speakers, and Lucia's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized this was it, her last chance, her final hope, her daughter's only shot at survival. 8-year-old Sophia was back home in their cramped studio apartment, staying with Mrs. Chin from next door, too weak from her recent chemotherapy session to even lift her head from the pillow, her once bright eyes now dulled by the poison they were pumping into her small body to fight the leukemia that had invaded their lives like a thief in the night. The experimental treatment in Miami, the one that could save Sophia's life, cost more money than Lucia would see in 5 lifetimes of working double shifts at the diner, more money than existed in her world of past due notices and empty cupboards. But Dr. Harrison had promised to see her, had agreed to at least discuss payment options if she could just get there. If she could just make this flight that had cost her 3 months of rent money. As she shuffled forward in the boarding line, surrounded by business travelers in expensive suits and families heading to vacation destinations she could only dream of, Lucia felt the familiar sting of being an outsider, of not belonging in this world of casual affluence where a plane ticket was an inconvenience rather than a financial catastrophe. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. "Sophia asking for you. Fever down a little. Pray for good news, Mija." The words blurred as tears threatened to spill, and Lucia quickly wiped her eyes, straightening her shoulders with a determination that had carried her through years of struggle as a single mother, through the shock of Sophia's diagnosis, through nights when she'd lain awake calculating and recalculating numbers that never added up to hope. Meanwhile, in the exclusive airline lounge just 50 yards away, Damon Wellington sat alone at a corner table, his 6'3" frame impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, the fabric perfectly tailored to his athletic build. A physique maintained through disciplined early morning workouts that served as much as therapy as fitness. At 35, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that filled any room he entered. Rich, dark skin that spoke of his African-American heritage, piercing intelligent eyes the color of aged whiskey that could dissect a business proposal in seconds or soften with unexpected warmth when he let his guard down, and a perfectly groomed beard that framed his strong jawline. His appearance was always flawless, From his precisely styled hair to his Italian leather shoes that gleamed under the lounge's ambient lighting. Because in his world, image was everything, perception was reality, and any sign of weakness or imperfection could be exploited by competitors, board members, or the media that followed his every move as the youngest black CEO in his industry's history. But beneath the polished exterior, beneath the confident smile he wore like armor in boardrooms and networking events, Damon carried a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of success could cure, a loneliness that echoed through his penthouse apartment and followed him into five-star hotel suites around the world. The Forbes article on the table beside his untouched breakfast praised his visionary leadership and unprecedented success in transforming Wellington Industries from a struggling manufacturing company into a tech empire, but it couldn't capture the cost of that transformation, the relationships sacrificed, the family gatherings missed, the slow erosion of trust that had driven away everyone who'd ever claimed to love him for who he was rather than what he could provide. His phone displayed 17 missed calls from his publicist, 12 from his assistant, and 1 from his mother that he'd been avoiding for 3 weeks because he couldn't bear to hear the disappointment in her voice again, couldn't endure another lecture about how success meant nothing if you had no one to share it with, couldn't face the truth that at 35, he was utterly and completely alone. The Miami trip was supposed to be different. 3 days of meetings with potential investors, yes, but also a chance to visit the children's hospital where his foundation had just funded a new wing, a chance to remember why he'd started this journey in the first place, back when he'd been a kid from the south side of Chicago who dreamed of changing the world rather than conquering it. But even that noble purpose felt hollow now, felt like another performance for the cameras, another way to prove to the world that Damon Wellington was more than just another rich black man who'd forgotten where he came from. The boarding announcement barely registered as he gathered his things. A leather briefcase that contained contracts worth millions, a laptop loaded with presentations that could reshape entire industries, and a phone that connected him to power brokers and decision-makers around the globe, yet couldn't bridge the gap between him and a single authentic human connection. The collision of their worlds began the moment Lucia stepped onto the plane, her economy ticket directing her toward the back of the aircraft, past the spacious first-class cabin where Damon had already settled into seat 1A, his laptop open to a presentation about sustainable manufacturing that he'd delivered so many times he could recite it in his sleep. Lucia's seat was 34B, wedged between a crying baby and a man who'd apparently bathed in cologne, but she barely noticed the discomfort as she tried to calculate for the 100th time whether the money left in her checking account would cover Sophia's medication until she got back, whether Mrs. Chen would know to call 911 if the fever spiked again, whether she was making the right choice by leaving her sick daughter to chase a hope that might be nothing more than a cruel mirage. The plane pushed back from the gate as Lucia pressed her face to the small window, watching Chicago shrink below them, carrying with it everything she knew and everyone she loved, and for a moment the magnitude of what she was doing. Flying across the country on money she didn't have to beg a doctor she'd never met to save her daughter's life, threatened to crush her completely. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer in Spanish, the same words her grandmother had taught her as a child, words that had carried her family through poverty and immigration and countless struggles, words that held the power of generations of women who had faced impossible choices with unwavering faith. The flight attendant's safety demonstration faded into background noise as Lucia's mind drifted to Sophia's face the morning she'd left, the way her daughter had smiled despite her pain and whispered, "Bring back good news, Mama," with a trust so complete and innocent that it had nearly broken Lucia's heart on the spot. Meanwhile, in first class, Damon stared at his own reflection in the window, seeing not the successful businessman that graced magazine covers and keynote stages, but the scared kid who'd grown up in a neighborhood where dreams were luxuries few could afford, where his mother had worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table and still found time to read to him every night, filling his head with stories of heroes and possibilities that seemed as distant as the stars. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now had everything that kid had dreamed of: money, power, respect, influence. Yet somehow, somewhere along the way, he'd lost the very thing that had made those dreams worth pursuing: the ability to connect with another human being without wondering about their motives, without calculating the potential cost, without assuming that every smile hid an agenda and every kindness came with a price tag. As the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign flickered off, a series of small events began to align like dominoes waiting to fall, each seemingly insignificant moment building toward a collision that would change 2 lives forever. Lucia unbuckled her seatbelt and made her way toward the bathroom, her stomach churning with anxiety and the cheap coffee she'd forced down at the airport, and as she walked past the first-class cabin, she caught a glimpse of the world she'd never inhabit: spacious seats that looked more like recliners, flight attendants offering warm towels and gourmet meals, passengers who looked relaxed and entitled as they sipped champagne and tapped on expensive laptops, people for whom air travel was a minor inconvenience rather than a financial catastrophe. The sight should have made her feel envious or resentful, but instead it only deepened her sense of isolation, her awareness that she was traveling through a world where she didn't belong, chasing a solution that required her to humble herself before people who would never understand what it meant to choose between rent and medicine, between hope and food. In seat 1A, Damon closed his laptop and rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar pressure of a headache building behind his eyes. The same headache that had plagued him for months, the physical manifestation of stress that no amount of success could alleviate. His phone buzzed with another message from his assistant. Board meeting moved to Thursday. Richards wants to discuss the Johnson acquisition before Miami presentation. Also, your mother called the office. The mention of his mother sent a pang of guilt through his chest, reminding him of conversations they'd had when he was younger, when she'd worried that his ambition would consume him, when she'd warned that money couldn't buy the things that truly mattered in life, warnings he'd dismissed as the concern of someone who didn't understand the corporate world, who couldn't appreciate the complexity of building an empire in an industry that still questioned whether a black man belonged in the boardroom. Now, at 35, he was beginning to understand what she'd been trying to tell him, beginning to realize that every rung he'd climbed on the ladder of success had required him to leave a piece of himself behind, until he'd reached the top only to discover he was completely alone. The flight attendant approached with a warm smile and offered him another drink, but Damon declined with a polite nod, his mind already drifting to the presentation he'd give in Miami, the investors he'd charm with projected profit margins and market analysis, the familiar dance of corporate seduction that had made him wealthy beyond his wildest childhood dreams but had also hollowed him out from the inside, leaving him successful but spiritually bankrupt, powerful but profoundly isolated. As Lucia returned from the bathroom, walking slowly back toward economy class, and as Damon shifted in his seat to stretch his long legs, neither of them could have imagined that in just a few moments, their carefully separated worlds would collide in a way that would strip away every assumption, every prejudice, every defense mechanism they'd built around their hearts, forcing them to see each other and themselves with a clarity that would change everything they thought they knew about love, about hope, about the possibility of finding connection in the most unexpected places. The moment that would forever divide Lucia's life into before and after began with something as mundane as turbulence, a sudden jolt that sent her stumbling forward just as she passed the first-class cabin on her way back to her seat. Her hand shot out instinctively to steady herself, gripping the armrest of seat 1A where Damon sat absorbed in his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be financial reports with the practiced ease of someone for whom million-dollar decisions were routine. The brief contact might have been nothing more than an apologetic, "excuse me," and a polite nod, two strangers sharing a moment of awkward airplane etiquette before returning to their separate worlds. But fate had other plans. As Lucia's fingers brushed against the soft leather of the armrest, her eyes inadvertently fell on Damon's phone screen, and what she saw there made her blood freeze in her veins. The email was open, clearly visible, with a subject line that read, "Wellington Foundation, Children's Hospital Funding Denial," and her daughter's name, Lucia Martinez, listed among a dozen other children whose cases had been rejected for emergency medical funding. The words swam before her eyes as she read fragments of clinical language. "Insufficient documentation, does not meet criteria, funding allocated to other priorities," each phrase hitting her like a physical blow. For 3 weeks, she had been waiting for a response from the Wellington Foundation, had submitted every form, every medical record, every desperate plea that Dr. Martinez at Chicago Children's Hospital had helped her compile, clinging to the hope that somewhere in the world, there existed people with resources who might care about a little girl fighting for her life. The application had been her Hail Mary, her last resort before this expensive flight to Miami, and seeing Sophia's name on a rejection list on the phone of a man flying first class while she'd scraped together pennies for an economy seat triggered something primal and furious inside her chest. "You," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the airplane's engine noise, but carrying a weight of accusation that made Damon look up from his screen with surprise. He saw a young Latina woman standing in the aisle beside his seat, her dark eyes blazing with an intensity that seemed to burn right through him, her small frame trembling with what he initially mistook for nervous energy but was actually pure, undiluted rage. She was beautiful in the way that genuine emotion makes someone beautiful, her honey-colored skin flushed with anger, her black hair slightly disheveled from her walk through the cabin, her simple navy dress and cardigan marking her as clearly out of place in the luxury of first class, but there was something in her expression that commanded attention, demanded recognition, refused to be dismissed or overlooked. "You're Damon Wellington," she continued, her voice growing stronger, more certain, as pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in her mind. The expensive suit, the commanding presence, the phone displaying emails from Wellington Foundation. This was the man whose signature was on the rejection letter that had arrived in her mailbox just 4 days ago. The man whose foundation claimed to help children but had dismissed her daughter's case with cold, corporate efficiency. "My daughter is Lucia Martinez, and you?" Her voice cracked with emotion, but she pushed forward. "You denied her funding. She's 8 years old, she has leukemia, and you said no." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation, and Damon felt something cold settle in his stomach as he looked at this woman, really looked at her, and saw not just anger but desperation, the kind of bone-deep terror that only a parent facing their child's mortality could understand. He started to speak, to explain that he didn't personally review funding applications, that there were committees and criteria and procedures, but before he could form the words, Lucia's hand was moving through the air with a speed and force that surprised them both. The slap rang out like a gunshot in the confined space of the aircraft, the sharp crack of palm against cheek echoing through first class and beyond, causing conversations to halt mid-sentence and heads to turn in shocked silence. The physical impact was significant. Damon's head snapped to the side, his cheek immediately flushing red from the force of the blow, but the emotional impact was seismic, reverberating through both of them with an intensity that neither had anticipated. For Lucia, The moment her hand connected with his face, she felt every ounce of rage, frustration, and helplessness that had been building inside her for months suddenly explode outward. All the nights she'd lain awake calculating medical bills, all the times she'd held Sophia during chemotherapy sessions, all the doors that had been slammed in her face by insurance companies and hospitals and foundations, all concentrated into this single act of defiance against a system that seemed designed to crush people like her. The satisfaction was immediate and fierce, a primal release that felt like justice, like finally striking back at the faceless bureaucracy that was slowly killing her daughter with red tape and cost-benefit analyses. But even as her hands stung from the impact, even as she saw the shock register in Damon's eyes, she knew she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had committed an act that would have consequences far beyond this moment, had potentially destroyed any chance of saving Sophia by attacking the very person whose foundation might have been her last hope. For Damon, the slap was more than a physical assault. It was a shattering of the carefully constructed barriers he'd built around himself, a violent intrusion into the bubble of privilege and insulation that had protected him from the real-world consequences of his business decisions. The sting on his cheek was nothing compared to the shock of being touched by genuine human emotion, by someone who saw him not as a powerful CEO or a strategic partner or a networking opportunity, but as the person directly responsible for her child's suffering. In that split second after the impact, as his cheek burned and his mind reeled, he experienced something he hadn't felt in years: complete vulnerability, the stripping away of pretense and position and power, leaving him exposed as simply a man who had been struck by a desperate mother. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity, though it lasted only seconds, as nearly 200 passengers processed what they had just witnessed. Flight attendants began moving toward them from both directions, their training kicking in as they prepared to handle what appeared to be an assault in progress, but their movements seemed to happen in slow motion as Damon and Lucia remained locked in a moment of raw, unfiltered truth. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling rapidly as adrenaline flooded her system, her eyes still blazing with righteous fury but now also showing the first hints of fear as she realized what she had done, the potential consequences of striking a wealthy, powerful man in front of hundreds of witnesses. He was staring at her with an expression that cycled through shock, confusion, and something else, something that might have been recognition or understanding, or the dawning awareness that this woman's anger was not random or unjustified but born from a pain so deep it had driven her to an act of desperation. "Ma'am, please return to your seat immediately," came the firm voice of the head flight attendant, a woman in her 50s who had clearly dealt with difficult passengers before but had never encountered a situation quite like this. Her hand was already reaching for the phone that would connect her to the captain, her mind calculating whether this incident required an emergency landing or simply restraint and law enforcement waiting at their destination. But before she could take action, before security protocols could be enacted, before the moment could spiral into chaos and legal consequences, Damon did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He raised his hand, the same gesture that in a boardroom commanded attention from millionaire executives, but here served a different purpose, and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly through the cabin. "It's okay," he said, his eyes never leaving Lucia's face, seeing in her expression a pain that resonated with something deep inside him, something he had buried under years of corporate success and emotional armor. "There's been a misunderstanding." The words were inadequate, he knew, a pale description of whatever had just passed between them, but they served their purpose of preventing immediate escalation, of buying time for him to process what had happened and why this woman's grief had moved her to violence against a complete stranger. The flight attendant hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and the surprising calm in Damon's voice, the lack of anger or demands for police intervention that she would have expected from a first-class passenger who had just been assaulted. Around them, other passengers were beginning to whisper and point, phones appearing as people debated whether to record what might become a viral video or simply gossip to share later, but the immediate crisis seemed to be contained by Damon's unexpected restraint. Lucia stood frozen in the aisle, her hands still tingling from the impact, her mind struggling to process his response, or lack thereof. She had expected fury, threats, demands for her arrest, the full weight of his wealth and power brought to bear against her act of defiance. Instead, he was looking at her with something that might have been curiosity, or concern, or the beginning of understanding, and that unexpected grace only made her feel worse about what she had done. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible but sincere, not because she regretted the anger that had driven her to strike him, but because she was beginning to realize that her target might have been misplaced, that the man whose cheek bore the red mark of her palm might not be the villain she had imagined. "My daughter, she's dying and I thought..." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't explain the complex web of desperation and hope and fury that had led to this moment, couldn't make sense of her own actions in a way that would satisfy strangers who were watching this drama unfold at 30,000 feet. The aftermath of the slap created a bubble of tension around seats 1A and the aisle beside it, as if the very air had become charged with the electricity of raw emotion and unspoken truths. Damon slowly raised his hand to his cheek, not in pain but in wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just occurred, couldn't process that someone had cared enough about something, about someone, to risk everything in a moment of desperate action. The touch of his fingers against his skin was gentle, almost reverent, and for reasons he couldn't articulate, he found himself thinking not about the assault he had just endured but about the passion that had driven it, the fierce love that could move a small woman to strike a man twice her size without thought for consequences or safety. Around them, the cabin began to return to a semblance of normalcy as passengers realized that no further violence was forthcoming, that whatever had happened between these two strangers was moving toward resolution rather than escalation, but the air still hummed with the tension of interrupted lives and altered trajectories. The flight attendant remained nearby, ready to intervene if the situation deteriorated, but Damon's calm demeanor and Lucia's obvious remorse seemed to indicate that the crisis had passed, leaving behind only the question of what would happen next, what consequences would follow from this collision of two worlds that should never have intersected. The tension in the first-class cabin stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at any moment, as Damon slowly lowered his hand from his reddened cheek and found himself doing something that surprised everyone watching, including himself. Instead of demanding the flight attendant call for an air marshal or insisting that Lucia be restrained for the remainder of the flight, he stood up from his seat with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to commanding rooms full of executives, his 6'3" frame unfolding with deliberate calm that seemed to fill the space around them with an unexpected sense of safety rather than threat. "Ma'am," he said to the hovering flight attendant, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had closed billion-dollar deals and swayed skeptical board members, "I'd like to speak with this woman privately. Perhaps we could use the area near the galley." His request was phrased as a suggestion, but there was something in his tone that made it clear he wasn't asking for permission so much as indicating his preference for how this situation should be handled. The flight attendant, her name tag read Jennifer, looked between them with the practiced eye of someone who had defused countless passenger conflicts, noting the absence of anger in Damon's demeanor and the genuine remorse radiating from Lucia's trembling form. "Sir, I really think we should follow standard protocol for passenger altercations," Jennifer began, but Damon shook his head with a gentle smile that transformed his entire face, softening the sharp angles of his features and revealing something vulnerable beneath the polished exterior. "There's been a misunderstanding about my foundation's work," he explained, his eyes finding Lucia's and holding them with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "This woman's daughter, Lucia Martinez, you said?" When Lucia nodded, barely trusting her voice, he continued, "I need to understand what happened with her case. Sometimes our administrative processes fail people who desperately need help, and I can't fix that if I don't know about it." The words hung in the air like a bridge extended across an impossible chasm, an offer of understanding that Lucia had never dared to hope for, and she found herself staring at this man she had just struck, trying to reconcile the compassionate stranger offering to help with the faceless corporation that had denied her daughter's funding. Jennifer ultimately agreed to their private conversation, perhaps sensing that whatever was unfolding between these two passengers was more complex than a simple assault case, and she discreetly guided them to a small area near the forward galley where they could speak without attracting further attention from curious passengers. The space was intimate by necessity, barely large enough for two people to stand without touching, and as they found themselves face to face in the dim lighting of the aircraft service area, both Lucia and Damon seemed to realize simultaneously how surreal their situation had become. She was a single mother from Chicago's South Side who had never been on a plane before today, wearing a thrift store dress and carrying the weight of her daughter's medical crisis on her shoulders like a physical burden, while he was a man whose net worth exceeded the GDP of small nations, whose decisions affected thousands of employees and millions of shareholders, whose face had graced the covers of Fortune and Forbes as a symbol of American business success. Yet here they stood, brought together by an act of violence born from desperation, forced to confront each other as human beings rather than archetypes or stereotypes or representatives of different social classes. "I need you to know that I don't personally review funding applications," Damon began, his voice softer now, more intimate in the confined space, and Lucia felt a flicker of disappointment that he was going to hide behind corporate bureaucracy, was going to distance himself from responsibility the way powerful people always did when confronted with the consequences of their decisions. But before she could respond, he held up a hand and continued, "But that doesn't matter, because it's my foundation, my responsibility, and if a child is being denied help because of administrative failures or arbitrary criteria, then I need to know about it." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, the genuine concern in his eyes making her suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with the recycled air of the airplane cabin, how his presence seemed to fill the small space with a warmth that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with the unexpected possibility that someone with the power to help might actually care. "Tell me about Sophia," he said, and something in the way he spoke her daughter's name, with reverence, with recognition of her individuality rather than treating her as just another case number, made Lucia's carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. She started talking, and once the words began flowing, they came in a torrent that surprised them both. 8 years of single motherhood condensed into breathless sentences, the joy of Sophia's birth followed by the terror of her diagnosis, the maze of medical bills and insurance denials and second opinions that had consumed their lives for the past 18 months. Lucia found herself describing details she had never shared with anyone. How Sophia still slept with the stuffed elephant Lucia had bought her on her second birthday, how she had learned to give herself shots because she didn't want her mama to hurt any more from having to do it, how she had asked last week if dying would hurt and whether Lucia would be okay without her. The words poured out of her like blood from a wound, each revelation making her more vulnerable but somehow also more powerful, as if speaking these truths to someone who might actually be able to help was an act of defiance against the silence and shame that poverty had imposed on her life. Damon listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail, his businessman's mind automatically calculating costs and solutions while his heart, a organ he had forgotten he possessed, began to ache with a pain he hadn't felt since his own childhood, when he had watched his mother work 3 jobs to keep their family afloat and had sworn that someday he would have enough money to solve any problem, to fix any crisis, to ensure that no child would ever have to suffer. The way he had watched his younger sister suffer when she couldn't afford the asthma medication that might have saved her life. When Lucia finished speaking, they stood in silence for a long moment, the hum of the airplane engines serving as a backdrop to the weight of shared understanding that had settled between them. The experimental treatment in Miami, Damon said finally, his voice rougher now, edged with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. How much does it cost? When Lucia whispered the figure, a number that represented more money than she had ever imagined possessing, he nodded slowly, his mind already working through logistics and possibilities. And Dr. Harrison, the physician you're going to see, he's willing to discuss payment plans? Lucia nodded, hope beginning to flutter in her chest like a bird testing its wings, but she forced herself to remain cautious, to guard against the crushing disappointment that would come if this conversation led nowhere, if this unexpected kindness turned out to be nothing more than polite corporate sympathy. But even as hope began to bloom between them in that cramped galley space, resistance was building in both their hearts, the natural human instinct to retreat from vulnerability, to protect themselves from the risk of connection and the potential for disappointment that comes with trusting another person. For Lucia, the resistance manifested as suspicion born from years of being let down by systems and institutions that claimed to help but ultimately served their own interests. She had learned the hard way that wealthy people often made promises they had no intention of keeping, that charity was frequently a public relations exercise rather than genuine compassion, and that getting her hopes up only made the inevitable rejection more painful. "Why would you help us?" she asked, her voice taking on a harder edge as her defenses reasserted themselves. "You don't know me, you don't know Sophia, and 5 minutes ago I slapped you in front of a plane full of people. What's in it for you? Some kind of tax write-off? Good publicity for your foundation?" The questions came out more aggressively than she had intended, but she couldn't help herself. The protective instincts that had kept her and Sophia alive through years of struggle were screaming warnings about trusting this man, about believing that someone with his wealth and power would genuinely care about a poor Latino woman and her sick daughter. Damon felt her suspicion like a physical blow, but he couldn't blame her for it. In her position, he would be asking the same questions, would be equally wary of promises from someone who lived in a completely different world. For his part, the resistance came from a different place, from the learned caution of a man who had been used and manipulated by countless people who saw his wealth as a solution to their problems, who had discovered that every act of generosity seemed to attract a dozen more requests, that kindness was often interpreted as weakness in the corporate world he inhabited. His inner voice, the one that had guided him through hostile takeovers and complex negotiations, was warning him to be careful, to maintain professional distance, to remember that emotional decisions were almost always bad business decisions. This woman had assaulted him, had accused him of being responsible for her daughter's suffering, had disrupted his carefully ordered world with her raw emotion and desperate need. Getting involved with her situation would be complicated, messy, potentially problematic from a legal standpoint if her case had indeed been improperly denied by his foundation. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to make some polite expression of sympathy, perhaps arrange for his assistant to review her daughter's case through proper channels, and then return to his seat and his spreadsheets and his insulated world where other people's tragedies were statistics rather than personal realities. But as he looked at Lucia's face, really looked at her, seeing past the suspicion and defensive anger to the bone-deep exhaustion beneath, the kind of weariness that came from fighting an impossible battle with insufficient weapons, he found himself unable to retreat into the comfortable distance that had protected him for so many years. The universe, it seemed, had its own plans for Damon Wellington and Lucia Martinez, plans that neither their resistance nor their carefully constructed defenses could derail. Just as the tension between them reached its peak, Lucia's suspicion warring with desperate hope, Damon's business instincts battling against an awakening compassion he hadn't felt in years, the airplane shuddered with a violence that sent both of them stumbling against the galley walls. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom with the kind of forced calm that immediately told experienced travelers something was seriously wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some mechanical difficulties and will need to make an emergency landing in Atlanta. Please return to your seats immediately and prepare for landing procedures. But before either Lucia or Damon could move toward their respective seats, the aircraft lurched again, this time with such force that the overhead compartments popped open, sending bags and personal items cascading into the aisles like a waterfall of chaos. Emergency lighting flickered on, bathing the cabin in an eerie amber glow, and suddenly the intimate space of the galley where they had been confronting their mutual wariness became a refuge from the panic that was beginning to spread through the passenger cabin. Jennifer, the flight attendant who had been monitoring their conversation from a discreet distance, appeared beside them with the professional composure of someone trained for crisis management, but Lucia could see fear flickering in her eyes as she efficiently secured loose items and checked safety equipment. "I need you both to stay here for now," Jennifer instructed, her voice steady despite the airplane's continued shuddering. "The cabin is chaotic, and it's safer for you to remain in this area until we've completed our emergency landing procedures." As if to punctuate her words, the aircraft dropped suddenly, that stomach-lurching sensation of an elevator falling too fast, and Lucia found herself grabbing instinctively for stability, her hand closing around Damon's arm with a grip that was part terror, part desperate need for human connection in a moment when mortality felt suddenly, viscerally real. The forced proximity of their situation, trapped together in a space barely large enough for two people while an airplane full of frightened passengers prepared for an emergency landing, created an intimacy that neither of them had anticipated or wanted, yet couldn't escape. Damon felt the tremor in Lucia's hand where it gripped his forearm, noticed how her breathing had become shallow and rapid as the reality of their situation sank in, and found himself responding not as a CEO calculating risk factors but as a human being recognizing another person's fear. "Hey," he said softly, covering her hand with his own, the gesture so natural and instinctive that neither of them questioned it in the moment. "We're going to be okay. These planes are built to handle much worse than this." His voice carried a confidence he didn't entirely feel. Emergency landings were never routine, no matter how much the airlines tried to downplay their seriousness, but something about her terror called out to a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed, a desire to shield her from additional pain when she was already carrying so much. Lucia looked up at him, her dark eyes wide with a vulnerability that made his chest tighten, and for a moment the anger and suspicion that had defined their interaction fell away, replaced by the simple human recognition that they were two people facing an uncertain situation together. "I can't die," she whispered, the words coming out in a rush of panic and desperation. Sophia needs me. If something happens to me, there's no one else. There's no family, no money for her treatment. She'll die alone in a hospital room and I won't be there to hold her hand. The raw terror in her voice had nothing to do with their current situation and everything to do with the larger crisis that had brought her to this plane in the first place. But in this moment of enforced intimacy, with death feeling suddenly possible, her deepest fears spilled out without filter or reservation. Damon found himself pulling her closer without conscious thought, his arms encircling her small frame as the plane continued to shake around them, and he was shocked by how perfectly she seemed to fit against his chest, how her presence seemed to fill some hollow space inside him that he hadn't even realized existed. As the airplane began its descent toward Atlanta, a process that felt both eternal and terrifyingly fast, Lucia and Damon found themselves sharing stories that they had never told anyone, confessions born from the strange intimacy that comes when strangers face possible death together. Lucia told him about the night Sophia was diagnosed, how she had sat in a hospital bathroom stall and cried until she had no tears left, how she had emerged with a determination forged from pure maternal love to fight every battle, climb every mountain, and break every rule if it meant saving her daughter's life. She described the guilt that ate at her daily, the knowledge that if she had been able to afford better insurance, earlier detection, specialists instead of clinic doctors, Sophia might not be fighting for her life now. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being selfish, she admitted, her voice muffled against his chest where she had somehow ended up as the plane continued its turbulent descent. Maybe I should let her go peacefully instead of putting her through all this pain, all these treatments that might not even work. But when I look at her, when I see how hard she's fighting, I can't give up. I can't be the mother who didn't try everything. Her words hit Damon like physical blows, each one reminding him of his own sister's death 15 years earlier, how he had watched helplessly as medical bills bankrupted his family, how he had sworn in the funeral home that if he ever had the power to prevent another family's suffering, he would use it without hesitation. In response, he found himself sharing memories he had locked away for years, growing up in a neighborhood where violence and poverty were constants, watching his mother work herself to exhaustion to keep their family afloat, the day his sister Keisha died from an asthma attack because they couldn't afford the medication that might have saved her life. I started the foundation because of her, he confessed, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Every child we help, every family we save from bankruptcy, it's supposed to honor her memory, supposed to mean that her death wasn't completely meaningless. But somewhere along the way, it became just another business operation, another tax advantage, another way to improve my public image. I forgot that behind every application is a real child, a real family, real people like you and Sophia who are fighting for their lives. The emergency landing in Atlanta was executed with the kind of professional precision that made commercial aviation safer than driving to the grocery store, but as the plane touched down with a jarring thud and the passengers burst into spontaneous applause, Lucia and Damon remained in their improvised sanctuary near the galley, reluctant to break the spell of intimacy that had been woven between them during those terrifying minutes in the air. They had been informed by Jennifer that all passengers would be accommodated in Atlanta overnight while the aircraft underwent inspection and repairs, that their flight to Miami would resume the following morning if the plane was deemed airworthy, or they would be transferred to another aircraft if necessary. The practical implications were straightforward: a minor inconvenience for most travelers, a slightly longer journey to their destinations. But for Lucia, the delay felt like a crushing blow to hopes that were already hanging by the thinnest of threads. She had calculated her finances down to the last dollar, had enough money for one night in Miami before she would need to return to Chicago regardless of the outcome of her meeting with Dr. Harrison, and an unexpected hotel stay in Atlanta threatened to derail her entire plan. But before she could voice these concerns, before the familiar panic could reassert itself, Damon made a decision that surprised them both. "We're not going to a hotel," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. "I have a corporate apartment here in Atlanta. My company keeps it for visiting executives and clients. It has 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and it's empty tonight. You can stay there, and we can continue this conversation about Sophia's treatment without the pressure of time or money." The offer was practical, generous, and completely inappropriate. They were strangers who had met through an act of violence, 2 people from completely different worlds who had no business spending an unplanned evening together in the intimate setting of a private apartment. Every rational instinct Lucia possessed screamed warnings about accepting such an offer from a man she barely knew, regardless of his apparent kindness or his wealth or his promises to help her daughter. Similarly, every professional instinct Damon had developed over years of corporate success warned him against getting personally involved with someone whose case his foundation had rejected, against opening his private space to a woman who had assaulted him just hours earlier, against allowing his emotions to override his business judgment in a situation that could have serious legal and financial implications. Yet as they disembarked the plane together, as they navigated the busy Atlanta airport side by side, as Damon arranged for a car to take them to his corporate apartment while Lucia clutched her small carry-on bag and tried to process the surreal turn her life had taken, both of them felt the irresistible pull of something larger than logic or caution or social conventions. Perhaps it was the shared vulnerability of their airplane conversation, the way crisis had stripped away their defenses and revealed the wounded people beneath their public personas. Perhaps it was the recognition that they were both fighting battles, his against isolation and meaninglessness, hers against poverty and time, that had left them equally desperate for authentic human connection. Or perhaps it was simply the mysterious alchemy that occurs when 2 lonely souls recognize something essential in each other, some fundamental compatibility that transcends circumstances and backgrounds and all the obvious reasons why they shouldn't be drawn together. As their taxi pulled away from the airport and headed toward downtown Atlanta, the city lights blurring past the windows like fallen stars, Lucia found herself stealing glances at Damon's profile, studying the strong line of his jaw, the intelligence in his eyes, the way his expensive clothes couldn't quite hide the tension he carried in his shoulders. For his part, Damon was acutely aware of her presence beside him, the way she worried her lower lip when she was thinking, the graceful movement of her hands as she tucked her hair behind her ear, the subtle scent of her skin that somehow managed to rise above the artificial air freshener in the taxi. Neither of them spoke during the 20-minute ride, but the silence between them was charged with possibility, with the sense that they were traveling toward something far more significant than a temporary accommodation, something that would change both their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The corporate apartment overlooking Atlanta's glittering skyline was a study in understated luxury, floor-to-ceiling windows that transformed the city into a living artwork, furniture that whispered rather than shouted its expense, and a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread rather than a place where actual meals were prepared. But as Lucia stepped across the threshold, her worn flats silent on the polished hardwood floors, she felt less like an intruder in a world of privilege and more like someone stepping into a beautiful but empty museum, all surface and no soul. Damon moved through the space with the practiced efficiency of familiarity, switching on lights and adjusting the temperature, but she noticed how he didn't really look at anything, how his movements suggested he was occupying the apartment rather than inhabiting it. "The guest room is down the hall," he said, his voice carrying a formality that seemed to have returned as soon as they'd left the intimate confines of the airplane, as if he were already retreating behind the protective barriers of wealth and status now that the immediate crisis had passed. But when he turned to face her, when their eyes met across the expanse of the living room, something in his expression shifted, a flicker of vulnerability that reminded her of the man who had held her during their emergency landing, who had shared stories about his sister's death with a raw honesty that had left them both emotionally exposed. "Lucia," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words that had never been difficult for him in boardrooms or business negotiations. "Before we talk about Sophia's treatment, before we figure out how to help her, I need you to understand something about me, about why your daughter's case was denied, about why I've become the kind of man who builds walls between himself and the very people he's supposed to be helping." The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge he was offering to build, an invitation to deeper intimacy that scared them both even as it drew them inexorably forward. What followed was a confession that neither of them had anticipated, a peeling back of layers that revealed wounds so deep they had shaped the fundamental architecture of Damon's adult life. He told her about Keisha, not just the fact of her death, which he had mentioned on the plane, but the devastating details that he had never shared with another living soul. How she had been 12 years old when the asthma attacks started getting worse, how their mother had worked 3 jobs but still couldn't afford the insurance that would have covered the specialist medications Keisha needed, how the free clinic had done their best but their best wasn't enough when dealing with a condition that required cutting-edge treatments. "The night she died," Damon said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper as he moved to stand at the windows overlooking the city, "I was supposed to be watching her while Mom worked the overnight shift at the hospital. Keisha had an attack, worse than usual, and I gave her the inhaler but it wasn't working. I called 911, but by the time the paramedics arrived..." He stopped, his shoulders rigid with a pain that 23 years hadn't diminished, and Lucia felt her heart breaking for the 12-year-old boy who had watched his sister die in his arms, who had carried that guilt and responsibility into adulthood like a stone in his chest. "I swore that night that I would become rich enough, powerful enough, to make sure no other child died because their family couldn't afford treatment. Every business decision I've made, every company I've acquired, every dollar I've earned, it was all supposed to be for Keisha, all supposed to honor her memory by saving other children." But then came the darker truth, the admission that cut deeper than grief. Somewhere along the way, the foundation had become just another corporate entity, staffed by administrators who saw applications as numbers rather than lives, who made decisions based on bureaucratic criteria rather than human need. "Your daughter's case was rejected because she didn't meet our geographic requirements. We only fund children in specific zip codes, areas where we can maximize our impact for publicity purposes. It wasn't about her medical need or her chances of survival or your ability to pay. It was about demographics and optics and making sure our charitable giving aligned with our corporate image strategy." The words came out like confessions at a tribunal, each one an indictment of the man he had become versus the boy who had made those desperate promises in a hospital waiting room 2 decades earlier. As Damon spoke, as his carefully constructed image of successful philanthropy crumbled before her eyes, Lucia found herself facing her own moment of terrible honesty, her own need to unveil the backstory that had shaped her into the woman desperate enough to slap a stranger on an airplane. She told him about Sophia's father, Carlos, and how their love story had begun with such promise. 2 young people from the same neighborhood who had dreamed of building something beautiful together, who had talked about escaping poverty through education and hard work and shared determination. Carlos had been studying engineering, working nights to pay for school, and Lucia had been pursuing her teaching degree, both of them believing that love and effort could overcome any obstacle, that their combined dreams were stronger than the systemic barriers that had kept their families trapped in cycles of struggle. When I got pregnant with Sophia, we were scared but excited, she said, settling onto the couch as if the weight of memory required her to sit down, her hands unconsciously moving to her stomach as she remembered carrying her daughter. Carlos proposed with a ring he bought with his textbook money, and we planned this simple wedding, nothing fancy but full of hope. We were going to graduate, get good jobs, buy a little house with a yard where Sophia could play. We had it all figured out. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Carlos had been walking home from his night job at a warehouse when he was killed in a drive-by shooting, caught in the crossfire of a gang dispute that had nothing to do with him, his dreams and their shared future erased in a moment of random violence that left Lucia 8 months pregnant and utterly alone. He never got to hold her, Lucia whispered, her voice breaking as she relived the devastating irony of Sophia being born just 3 weeks after her father's funeral, how she had labored through contractions while grieving a love that had been stolen before it could fully bloom. Sometimes I look at Sophia and I see his eyes, his smile, his stubborn determination to keep fighting even when everything seems impossible. When she was diagnosed with leukemia, I felt like the universe was trying to take away the last piece of him I had left, and I couldn't let that happen. I can't let that happen. The revelations that had poured out of them both seemed to hang in the air of the luxurious apartment like ghosts made visible, the weight of shared grief and regret and desperate love creating an intimacy more profound than anything either of them had ever experienced. Damon turned from the windows to look at Lucia, seeing her not as the angry woman who had slapped him or the desperate mother seeking his foundation's help, but as a fellow survivor of devastating loss, someone who understood the particular kind of pain that comes from failing to protect the people you love most. The parallel between their stories was impossible to ignore. Both had lost the person most precious to them. Both had spent years trying to honor that memory through their actions. Both had discovered that good intentions weren't always enough to bridge the gap between wanting to help and actually helping. But there was something else in the air between them now, something that had been building since their first encounter on the plane but was only now becoming clear, an attraction that went far beyond physical chemistry, a recognition of something essential and complementary in each other's souls. When Damon crossed the room to sit beside her on the couch, when he reached out to take her hand in both of his, the gesture felt as natural and inevitable as breathing, as if they had been moving toward this moment of connection from the instant she had raised her hand to strike his cheek. "Lucia," he said, her name a prayer on his lips, "I can't bring back Carlos or Keisha, can't undo the mistakes I've made or the people I've failed to help. But I can save Sophia. Not through the foundation, not through bureaucratic processes or tax-deductible donations, but personally, directly, immediately. I can call Dr. Harrison tonight, arrange for the best treatment money can buy, make sure she has everything she needs not just to survive but to thrive." The promise hung between them like a sacred vow, but even as hope bloomed in Lucia's chest, even as she felt the crushing weight of financial terror beginning to lift for the first time in months, she found herself hesitating, her hard-won survival instincts warning her that accepting such an offer would change everything between them, would create debts and obligations and complications that could destroy the fragile connection they were building. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling with the effort to maintain some distance, some protection against the disappointment that would crush her if this turned out to be another empty promise from another wealthy person who ultimately wouldn't follow through. Why would you do this for us? What do you want in return? The questions were harsh, practical, born from years of learning that everything in life came with a price, but they were also necessary, the only way she could protect her heart and Sophia's hopes from another devastating blow. The question Lucia had posed, what did he want in return, hung between them like a challenge and an invitation, forcing Damon to confront motivations he hadn't fully understood himself until this moment. He could have given her the easy answer, the one that would have satisfied her practical concerns while maintaining the safe distance that wealth and power usually afforded him, that helping Sophia was simply the right thing to do, a way to honor his sister's memory, a chance to use his resources for genuine good rather than corporate image building. But sitting there in the soft lighting of his sterile corporate apartment, with Lucia's hands still resting in his and her dark eyes searching his face for signs of deception or hidden agenda, Damon found himself unable to retreat behind the comfortable lies that had protected him for years. "I want," he began, then stopped, the words catching in his throat as he realized he was about to admit something that would make him completely vulnerable, something that would strip away every defense he had built around his heart. "I want to feel like my life means something again. I want to remember what it's like to care about someone else's pain more than my own success. I want to stop being the kind of man who's forgotten how to connect with another human being without calculating what I can gain from the relationship." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he continued, his thumb unconsciously tracing circles on the back of her hand. "But more than that, Lucia, I want to know you. I want to understand how someone who has lost so much can still love so fiercely, can still fight so hard for hope when everything around you is falling apart. I want to learn from you, because somehow in the space of a few hours, you've shown me what I've been missing, what I've sacrificed in my pursuit of success." The admission was raw, honest, and terrifying in its implications, because it meant he wasn't offering to help Sophia out of charitable impulse or guilt over his foundation's failures, but because helping her daughter might be the key to healing something broken inside himself, might be the path back to the man he had been before grief and ambition had turned him into someone he barely recognized. Lucia felt something shift inside her chest as she listened to his confession, a cautious warmth beginning to thaw the frozen places in her heart that had been locked away since Carlos's death. For 3 years, she had been so focused on survival, working multiple jobs, navigating medical bureaucracies, fighting insurance companies, managing Sophia's care, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as anything other than a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed. But Damon was looking at her like she was something precious, something worth knowing and understanding, and the intensity of his attention was both thrilling and terrifying. "You think I'm strong," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and bitter laughter, "but you don't know how many nights I've cried myself to sleep, how many times I've wanted to give up, how many moments I've felt like a complete failure as a mother." She pulled her hand free from his, not in rejection but in the need to move, to pace, to channel the nervous energy that was building inside her as emotional walls she had spent years constructing began to crumble. "You want to know who I really am, Damon? I'm a woman who lies awake at night wondering if Sophia would have been better off with a different mother, someone who could have afforded better insurance, someone who could have caught her cancer earlier, someone who could give her the life she deserves instead of dragging her through poverty and fear and uncertainty." She moved to the windows, pressing her palms against the cool glass as she stared out at the city lights that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. "I'm selfish enough to keep fighting for her life even when the treatments make her so sick she can barely lift her head, even when she begs me to let her stop, even when I know that every day of her suffering is because I can't accept the possibility of losing her. The words poured out of her like water through a broken dam, confessions she had never spoken aloud because saying them would make them real, would force her to confront the guilt that ate at her from the inside. But in the reflection of the window, she could see Damon behind her, could see the way he was listening with his entire being, and somehow his presence made it safe to voice the fears that had been consuming her soul. When he rose from the couch and crossed to stand behind her at the windows, when she felt the warmth of his body she hadn't felt since Carlos died, the comfort of not being alone with her burdens, the relief of sharing the weight of impossible decisions with someone who seemed to understand the cost of loving someone more than your own life. "You're not selfish," Damon said, his voice soft but certain, and she could feel his breath warm against her ear as he spoke. "You're a mother. You're doing what every parent would do, fighting for your child's life with everything you have, refusing to give up even when the odds are impossible. That's not selfishness, that's love in its purest form." His hands came to rest on her shoulders, a gesture that was somehow both intimate and respectful, offering comfort without demanding anything in return. "And Sophia isn't suffering because you're a bad mother or because you're poor or because you've made wrong choices. She's suffering because life is sometimes cruel and unfair, because cancer doesn't care about good people or loving families or children who deserve better. But she's also alive, she's still fighting, she still smiles and loves and hopes because you've given her those gifts, because you've shown her that she's worth fighting for." They stood together in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the city pulse with life below them, and Lucia found herself leaning back slightly until she was resting against his chest, drawn by the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and the sense of safety she hadn't felt in years. "Tell me about her," Damon said eventually, his voice rumbling through his chest where she could feel it as much as hear it. "Not about her illness, not about the treatments or the medical bills or the insurance fights. Tell me about Sophia, who she is when she's not being a patient, what makes her laugh, what dreams she has for the future." The request was so simple, yet it struck Lucia as revolutionary, because for so long Sophia's identity had been consumed by her diagnosis, her entire existence reduced to test results and treatment protocols and prognoses that changed with each doctor's visit. The smile spread across Lucia's face as she began to talk about her daughter, really talk about her, not as a medical case but as the extraordinary little girl who had somehow managed to maintain her sense of wonder and joy despite everything she had endured. She told Damon about Sophia's obsession with astronomy, how she spent hours looking up at the stars through their apartment window and dreaming about becoming an astronaut who would explore other planets and maybe find places where children didn't get sick. She described Sophia's uncanny ability to make friends with every nurse and doctor she encountered, how she remembered details about their families and asked about their pets and somehow made even the most clinical medical appointments feel warm and personal. "She has this way of finding magic in ordinary things," Lucia said, her voice growing soft with maternal pride. Last week, when she was too weak to leave the apartment, she spent an entire afternoon watching raindrops race down the window and making up stories about where each drop was going, what adventures it would have when it reached the ground. She turned a rainy day into an epic tale about brave water drops saving their kingdoms from drought. As she spoke, Lucia became aware of how Damon's arms had somehow found their way around her waist, how they were standing pressed together like lovers watching the sunset, how natural and right it felt to be held by someone who listened to her stories about Sophia with genuine interest rather than polite sympathy. The realization should have frightened her. She barely knew this man, had met him through an act of violence just hours earlier, had no business feeling so comfortable in his embrace, but instead of fear, she felt a growing sense of rightness, as if some part of her soul had been waiting her entire life for this moment, this connection, this feeling of being truly seen and valued by another person. When she turned in his arms to face him, when she looked up into his eyes and saw not pity or charity but something that might have been the beginning of love, she felt her breath catch in her throat. "Damon," she whispered, his name carrying all the questions she couldn't voice, all the fears and hopes and possibilities that were building between them like a storm waiting to break. He reached up to cup her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the delicate line of her cheekbones, and for a moment they simply stared at each other, both of them recognizing that they were balanced on the edge of something that would change everything, something that would transform this chance encounter into something deeper and more meaningful than either of them had dared to hope for. "I know this is crazy," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know we've just met, know that everything about this situation is impossible and complicated and probably doomed to failure. But Lucia, I haven't felt this alive, this connected to another person in years. You've reminded me what it means to care about something more than profit margins and stock prices and board meetings. You've shown me what real strength looks like, what genuine love can accomplish, what it means to fight for something that truly matters." The words hung between them like a promise and a prayer, and when Lucia rose up on her toes to close the distance between them, when their lips met in a kiss that was tender and desperate and full of all the longing that had been building between them since that moment of violence on the airplane, both of them knew that whatever happened next, they had found something rare and precious in each other, something worth protecting and nurturing despite all the obstacles that lay ahead. The shrill ring of Damon's phone at 3:17 in the morning shattered the peaceful cocoon they had built around themselves, jerking both of them from the first deep sleep either had enjoyed in months. Lucia stirred against his chest where she had fallen asleep after hours of talking, sharing stories, and stealing gentle kisses that had felt like promises of a future neither had dared to imagine just 24 hours earlier. They had talked until nearly midnight, of becoming an astronaut, about Damon's childhood memories of Keisha, about the possibility of a life where love didn't have to compete with survival, where hope didn't require sacrificing everything else. But now, as Damon's phone continued its insistent buzzing on the nightstand, the harsh intrusion of the outside world felt like a violation of the sacred space they had created together. He reached for the device with a groan, squinting at the caller ID with eyes that weren't quite focused, and Lucia felt her stomach drop as she saw his expression change from sleepy contentment to sharp, professional alertness. "Wellington," he answered, his voice immediately taking on the crisp authority she had heard him use with the flight attendant, and she knew without being told that whatever was happening on the other end of that call was about to destroy the fragile peace they had found in each other's arms. She couldn't hear the words being spoken by his caller, but she could see the tension building in his shoulders, could watch his face cycling through expressions of surprise, concern, and what looked like growing anger. "How long has this been public?" he asked, sitting up abruptly and running his free hand through his hair. "No, I haven't seen the video. Send me the link immediately." The word video sent ice through Lucia's veins, and she sat up beside him, pulling the sheet around herself as a growing sense of dread settled in her chest like a stone. "What's happened?" she whispered, but Damon held up a finger, his attention completely absorbed by whatever crisis was unfolding through his phone. "I don't care what time it is in Los Angeles," he was saying, his voice taking on the hard edge she imagined he used in hostile boardroom negotiations. "Get me Harrison, get me the entire PR team, and get me our legal department. We need to control this narrative before it spins completely out of control." As he ended the call, as he turned to face her with an expression that had transformed from tender lover back to corporate Lucia felt the first cracks forming in the beautiful dream they had been building together. "There's a video," Damon said, his voice careful and controlled in a way that made Lucia's skin crawl with apprehension. Someone on the plane yesterday recorded what happened between us, and it's gone viral. Completely viral, millions of views in just a few hours, trending on every social media platform, picked up by news outlets across the country. He was scrolling through his phone as he spoke, his face illuminated by the harsh blue glow of the screen, and she could see headlines flashing past that made her stomach churn with a mixture of humiliation and terror. The angle makes it look worse than it was. Whoever filmed it caught the slap clearly, but not our conversation afterward, not the context, not the explanation. It just shows a young Latino woman striking a black businessman in first class, and the internet has. He paused, seeming to struggle with how to continue, and Lucia felt her world beginning to collapse around her even before he showed her the phone. The video was indeed damning. Shot from several rows behind them, it captured the moment of impact with crystal clarity, showing her small frame compared to his imposing presence, the shock on the faces of other passengers, the immediate response of the flight attendants. But it cut off before their private conversation, before his unexpected grace and understanding, before any hint that this was more complex than a simple assault by an unstable passenger. The comments section was a cesspool of racial stereotypes and class warfare, with people taking sides based on assumptions about who they were and what the incident represented. Entitled "Woman Attacks Successful Black CEO," read one headline. "Poor Passenger Assaults Wealthy Businessman Over Unknown Grievance," read another. But worse were the comments that had identified her by name, that had somehow tracked down her address, her workplace, even details about Sophia's illness that they were using to either vilify her as a desperate mother gone wrong or Leoneize her as a victim of systemic inequality. "They know about Sophia," she whispered, her voice breaking as she realized that her daughter's private medical information was being dissected by strangers on the internet, that their most intimate struggles were being turned into entertainment for people who had no understanding of their reality. "They know everything about us, and they're turning it into some kind of political statement about race and class and, oh God, Damon, what have I done?" The full scope of the disaster became clear as Damon's phone continued buzzing with calls from reporters, board members, investors, and crisis management specialists, each ring driving another wedge between the intimate connection they had forged and the harsh realities of his public persona. His assistant had sent him a comprehensive briefing that painted a picture of a public relations nightmare spiraling completely out of control. His stock price was dropping in after-hours trading, 3 major investors had called emergency meetings to discuss his fitness for leadership, and a prominent civil rights organization was demanding a public statement about the incident and his response to it. "This is exactly the kind of controversy my board has been waiting for," Damon said, his voice tight with frustration as he paced the length of the bedroom, already pulling on clothes with the efficient movements of a man accustomed to crisis management. "There are people who have never been comfortable with a young black CEO running a major corporation, who have been looking for any excuse to question my judgment, my stability, my ability to maintain the kind of image they think the company needs. This video, this situation, it gives them everything they need to challenge my position." Lucia watched him transform before her eyes from the tender, vulnerable man who had held her through the night back into the polished corporate executive who lived his life under constant scrutiny, and she felt herself becoming smaller, more invisible, as the distance between their worlds reasserted itself with brutal clarity. "Your PR people," she said, her voice barely audible but carrying a question that cut to the heart of her deepest fears. "What are they going to recommend? How are you going to handle this?" The silence that followed her question was deafening, and in that pause, She could see him making calculations, weighing options, considering strategies that would protect his career and his company and his carefully constructed public image. When he finally spoke, his words confirmed her worst fears. They're going to recommend that I distance myself from you completely. No contact, no association, no appearance of ongoing involvement with someone who assaulted me on camera. They'll want me to characterize it as an isolated incident involving a disturbed passenger, emphasize that I chose not to press charges as an act of mercy, and make it clear that there's no relationship between us that could be misconstrued as inappropriate or compromising. The betrayal, when it came, wasn't dramatic or cruel. It was worse than that. It was coldly practical, delivered with the kind of corporate efficiency that made it clear how easily their connection could be sacrificed on the altar of public perception and professional necessity. Lucia, Damon said, and she could hear the regret in his voice even as he spoke words that would destroy everything beautiful they had built together. I have to think about my employees, about the thousands of people whose jobs depend on the company's stability, about the investors who trust me with their money, about the foundation's ability to help other children like Sophia if my reputation is destroyed by this scandal. Each word felt like a blade sliding between her ribs, precise and surgical and devastating. My legal team is going to argue that any personal relationship between us could be construed as coercion, that people will assume I only helped Sophia because we. He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the ugly implications that his lawyers had no doubt already outlined for him. The optics are terrible, Lucia. A wealthy CEO and a poor single mother, a foundation rejection followed by a personal intervention, accusations of favoritism or worse. It's exactly the kind of scandal that destroys careers and companies. She listened to his explanation with the growing numbness that comes from shock, from the realization that she had been a fool to believe, even for a few hours, that someone like Damon Wellington could genuinely care about someone like her without calculating the cost. So what happens to Sophia? She asked, her voice flat and emotionless, because she already knew the answer, could see it in the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes. The foundation will expedite a review of her case through proper channels, he said, the words sounding rehearsed, corporate, completely divorced from the intimate conversations they had shared about her daughter's dreams and fears. I'll make sure she gets fair consideration, but it has to go through official processes now, has to be defensible from a legal and ethical standpoint. The offer was generous by any objective measure, more than she had hoped for when she first stepped onto that airplane, but it felt like ashes in her mouth, like charity dispensed by a stranger rather than love offered by someone who understood her heart. I see, Lucia said, rising from the bed with a dignity that surprised them both, gathering her clothes with movements that were careful and controlled despite the devastation she felt inside. So last night was what, exactly? A moment of weakness? A temporary lapse in judgment that you're now ready to correct. The question hung between them like an accusation, and she could see the pain it caused him, could watch him struggle between the man who had held her so tenderly and the CEO who had learned to prioritize survival over sentiment. Last night was the most real I've felt in years, he said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. Last night was everything I didn't know I was missing, everything I've been searching for without realizing it. But Lucia, we can't, the world won't let us have what we found together, and if I try to fight for it, I'll lose everything, including my ability to help Sophia or any other child who needs what my foundation can provide. The tragedy of his position wasn't lost on her. He was trapped by the very success that gave him the power to help, constrained by the expectations and responsibilities that came with wealth and influence. But understanding his dilemma didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. didn't ease the crushing realization that their connection, no matter how real or powerful or transformative, wasn't strong enough to overcome the brutal practicalities of their different worlds. The shrill ring of Damon's phone at 3:17 in the morning shattered the peaceful cocoon they had built around themselves, jerking both of them from the first deep sleep either had enjoyed in months. Lucia stirred against his chest where she had fallen asleep after hours of talking, sharing stories, and stealing gentle kisses that had felt like promises of a future neither had dared to imagine just 24 hours earlier. They had talked until nearly midnight, about Sophia's dreams of becoming an astronaut, about Damon's childhood memories of Keisha, about the possibility of a life where love didn't have to compete with survival, where hope didn't require sacrificing everything else. But now, as Damon's phone continued its insistent buzzing on the nightstand, the harsh intrusion of the outside world felt like a violation of the sacred space they had created together. He reached for the device with a groan, squinting at the caller ID with eyes that weren't quite focused, and Lucia felt her stomach drop as she saw his expression change from sleepy contentment to sharp, professional alertness. "Wellington," he answered, his voice immediately taking on the crisp authority she had heard him use with the flight attendant, and she knew without being told that whatever was happening on the other end of that call was about to destroy the fragile peace they had found in each other's arms. She couldn't hear the words being spoken by his caller, but she could see the tension building in his shoulders, could watch his face, cycling through expressions of surprise, concern, and what looked like growing anger. "How long has this been public?" he asked, sitting up abruptly and running his free hand through his hair. "No, I haven't seen the video. Send me the link immediately." The word video sent ice through Lucia's veins, and she sat up beside him, pulling the sheet around herself as a growing sense of dread settled in her chest like a stone. "What's happened?" she whispered, but Damon held up a finger, his attention completely absorbed by whatever crisis was unfolding through his phone. "I don't care what time it is in Los Angeles," he was saying, his voice taking on the hard edge she imagined he used in hostile boardroom negotiations. "Get me Harrison, get me the entire PR team, and get me our legal department. We need to control this narrative before it spins completely out of control." As he ended the call, as he turned to face her with an expression that had transformed from tender lover back to corporate to, Lucia felt the first cracks forming in the beautiful dream they had been building together. "There's a video," Damon said, his voice careful and controlled in a way that made Lucia's skin crawl with apprehension. "Someone on the plane yesterday recorded what happened between us, and it's gone viral. Completely viral, millions of views in just a few hours, trending on every social media platform, picked up by news outlets across the country." He was scrolling through his phone as he spoke, his face illuminated by the harsh blue glow of the screen, and she could see headlines flashing past that made her stomach churn with a mixture of humiliation and terror. "The angle makes it look worse than it was. Whoever filmed it caught the slap clearly, but not our conversation afterward, not the context, not the explanation. It just shows a young Latino woman striking a black businessman in first class, and the internet has." He paused, seeming to struggle with how to continue, and Lucia felt her world beginning to collapse around her even before he showed her the phone. The video was indeed damning. Shot from several rows behind them, it captured the moment of impact with crystal clarity, showing her small frame compared to his imposing presence, the shock on the faces of other passengers, the immediate response of the flight attendants. But it cut off before their private conversation, before his unexpected grace and understanding, before any hint that this was more complex than a simple assault by an unstable passenger. The comments section was a cesspool of racial stereotypes and class warfare, with people taking sides based on assumptions about who they were and what the incident represented. Entitled Woman Attacks Successful Black CEO, read one headline. Poor passenger assaults wealthy businessman over unknown grievance, read another. But worse were the comments that had identified her by name, that had somehow tracked down her address, her workplace, even details about Sophia's illness that they were using to either vilify her as a desperate mother gone wrong or leonize her as a victim of systemic inequality. They know about Sophia, she whispered, her voice breaking as she realized that her daughter's private medical information was being dissected by strangers on the internet, that their most intimate struggles were being turned into entertainment for people who had no understanding of their reality. They know everything about us, and they're turning it into some kind of political statement about race and class and, oh God, Damon, what have I done? The humiliation was crushing, but worse was the fear that this exposure would somehow hurt Sophia, would turn her daughter's fight for life into a public spectacle that would follow them forever. As dawn broke over Atlanta's skyline, Damon's corporate apartment transformed into a war room, with phones ringing constantly and a parade of advisors arriving to manage what one particularly dramatic consultant called the crisis of the decade. Lucia watched from the bedroom doorway as Damon's world mobilized around him. His personal assistant, his public relations team, his lawyers, even a board member who had flown in from New York on a red-eye flight, all of them treating her presence like a toxic contaminant that needed to be carefully managed. She could hear fragments of their heated discussions: complete separation, damage control, protect the brand, minimize liability, each phrase driving home how fundamentally their perspectives had shifted overnight. The woman who had been his lover just hours earlier was now being discussed as a problem to be solved, a risk to be mitigated, a potential threat to everything he had spent his adult life building. Mr. Wellington, said his head of legal affairs, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive suit who had barely acknowledged Lucia's existence. Any continued association with Ms. Martinez could be construed as evidence of impropriety, coercion, or worse. The optics are catastrophic. A wealthy CEO appears to offer special treatment to a woman who assaulted him after she was rejected by his foundation. It creates liability issues, ethical concerns, and feeds into every negative stereotype about corruption and favoritism. The legal team had prepared a comprehensive strategy that felt like watching her life being dissected by strangers. Damon would issue a statement emphasizing that he had chosen not to press charges as an act of mercy, that there was no ongoing relationship between them, and that any future consideration of Sophia's case would go through proper channels without his personal involvement. They had even drafted talking points that painted Lucia as a desperate mother whose emotional breakdown on the airplane was understandable but inexcusable, a narrative that acknowledged her humanity while completely erasing the connection that had bloomed between them. The foundation's reputation is at stake, another advisor chimed in, spreading financial projections across the coffee table like battle plans. 3 major donors have already called asking for explanations, and 2 corporate sponsors are threatening to pull their support if this becomes a pattern of personal intervention overriding institutional processes. We're talking about millions of dollars in potential losses, funding that helps hundreds of children every year. Each word felt like a nail in the coffin of their relationship, a reminder that Damon's responsibility extended far beyond his personal feelings, that his position came with obligations that made their connection not just inconvenient but actively destructive to the very mission that had brought them together. The final blow came not from the lawyers or PR specialists or board members, but from Damon himself, delivered with the cold precision of a man who had learned to compartmentalize his heart in service of larger responsibilities. He found her in the guest bedroom where she had retreated as his apartment filled with the machinery of damage control, sitting on the edge of the bed in the same navy dress she had worn on the plane, looking small and lost and utterly out of place in this world of corporate crisis management. "Lucia," he said, his voice carefully neutral, professionally compassionate, completely devoid of the warmth that had made her believe in fairy tales and second chances and the possibility that love could bridge any gap. "My team has arranged for a car to take you to the airport. There's a first-class ticket waiting for you on the next flight to Miami. You'll be there in time for your appointment with Dr. Harrison at 2 o'clock. The generosity of the gesture should have felt like kindness, but delivered in that clinical tone, it felt like a payoff, like the cost of her silence and cooperation in the narrative they were constructing. "The foundation will expedite a full review of Sophia's case," he continued, each word precisely chosen and legally vetted. "She'll receive fair consideration through our standard processes, and if she qualifies for funding, the approval will come through proper institutional channels that can't be questioned or challenged." He was offering her everything she had originally come seeking: a chance for Sophia's treatment, consideration from his foundation, even the luxury of first-class travel. But it all felt hollow now, poisoned by the knowledge that these gifts came not from love but from a desperate need to contain the damage she had caused to his carefully ordered life. "What about us?" she asked, the question torn from her throat despite knowing how pathetic it made her sound, how naive and unrealistic and completely inappropriate given everything that had happened in the past few hours. "What about what we found together? What about everything you said last night about feeling alive again, about remembering what it means to care about someone?" The pain in her voice was naked and raw, and she saw it hit him like a physical blow, saw the way his composure cracked for just a moment to reveal the man who had held her so tenderly, who had shared his deepest wounds and most sacred memories with a stranger who had somehow become the most important person in his world. "Last night was a mistake," he said, and the lie was so transparent, so obviously painful for him to speak, that it hurt worse than if it had been true. "I was emotional, vulnerable, not thinking clearly about the implications or the consequences. You were desperate and grateful, and I took advantage of that desperation in a way that was completely inappropriate. We're from different worlds, Lucia, and what happened between us can't survive in the real world where actions have consequences and everything has a price." Each word was designed to create distance, to rewrite their story in a way that absolved them both of the responsibility for caring about each other, but she could see the cost of speaking them in the way his hands trembled slightly, in the muscle that jumped in his jaw, in the careful way he avoided meeting her eyes directly. The flight to Miami felt like traveling through a waking nightmare, each mile carrying Lucia further from the man who had awakened something in her heart that she had thought died with Carlos, and closer to a future that felt hollow despite the hope it should have contained. The first-class seat that Damon's assistant had arranged was luxurious beyond anything she had ever experienced. Soft leather that cradled her like an embrace, attentive flight attendants who offered champagne and gourmet meals, legroom that allowed her to stretch out completely, but every comfort felt like a reminder of the distance between their worlds. Every kindness like an echo of what she had lost when dawn brought reality crashing back into their perfect night. She stared out the window at clouds that looked like cotton candy against an impossibly blue sky, and found herself remembering how Damon had described his sister's fascination with flying, how Keisha had pressed her face to airplane windows during their one-family vacation and declared that she was going to become a pilot someday. The memory made her chest ache with a longing that had nothing to do with her destination and everything to do with the man she had left behind in Atlanta, surrounded by advisors who saw her as a problem to be solved rather than a woman who had somehow managed to crack open his carefully guarded heart. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications, reporters who had somehow gotten her number, friends and neighbors who had seen the viral video, even strangers who wanted to offer support or criticism or unsolicited advice about her situation. But the one call she desperately wanted, the one voice that could have made sense of the chaos consuming her life, remained silent. Damon had kept his word about maintaining professional distance, about treating their connection as if it had never existed, and each hour of silence felt like another small death. Another piece of evidence that their night together had been as fragile and temporary as she had always feared it would be. Meanwhile, 300 miles away in his Atlanta office, Damon sat through what should have been a triumphant board meeting. His crisis management team had successfully contained the video scandal, stock prices had stabilized, and major investors were satisfied with his handling of the situation. But he felt more empty and defeated than he had since the darkest days after Keisha's death. The conference room was filled with congratulations and relief, his advisors patting themselves on the back for their swift and decisive damage control, but every word of praise felt like acid in his veins because he knew the cost of their success. He had traded the most authentic connection he had felt in years for the preservation of his corporate image, had chosen the safety of professional distance over the terrifying vulnerability of genuine love, and the victory felt like the most profound loss of his life. The foundation has received unprecedented positive coverage from this incident, his PR director was saying, scrolling through news articles that painted him as a compassionate leader who had shown grace under pressure. 3 new corporate sponsors have reached out. Donations are up 40% from last week, and the board of the Children's Medical Foundation in Houston wants to discuss a potential partnership. Each piece of good news should have vindicated his decision, should have proven that sacrificing his personal happiness had served the greater good, but instead it made him feel sick with the knowledge that he was profiting from Lucia's pain, building his reputation on the foundation of her public humiliation. His assistant knocked on the conference room door with an update that made his chest tighten with emotions he was trying desperately to suppress. "Sir, Dr. Harrison's office called to confirm that Ms. Martinez made her appointment in Miami. The consultation went well, and he's optimistic about Sophia's chances with the experimental treatment." The news should have brought him relief, should have satisfied the part of him that genuinely wanted to help her daughter, but instead it felt like another reminder of everything he had given up, another twist of the knife in wounds that were still bleeding from this morning's deliberate cruelty. Also, his assistant continued with the carefully neutral tone she used for sensitive matters. The Foundation's Medical Review Board has fast-tracked Sophia Martinez's application. Based on Dr. Harrison's recommendations and her updated medical records, she meets all criteria for emergency funding. The paperwork is ready for your signature. The irony was almost unbearable. Sophia would receive the help she needed through official channels, exactly as his lawyers had recommended, but the process felt mechanical and cold compared to the passionate commitment he had felt when speaking with Lucia about her daughter's dreams and fears and hopes for the future. The turning point came when Damon returned to his empty penthouse that evening, walking through rooms that had never felt more like a museum than a home, surrounded by expensive art and designer furniture that reflected wealth but revealed nothing about the soul of the man who lived there. He found himself standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Atlanta's skyline, the same windows where he had held Lucia just 24 hours earlier as she told him about Sophia's fascination with stars and dreams of space exploration. The memory hit him with physical force, and he pressed his palm against the glass as if he could somehow reach through it to touch the woman who had shown him what his life could be if he had the courage to choose love over safety, connection over control. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened glass. A successful businessman in an expensive suit, surrounded by all the trappings of achievement, utterly and completely alone in a way that success had never been able to cure. "What have I done?" he whispered to his reflection, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of a soul finally recognizing its own emptiness. His phone lay silent on the coffee table, Lucia's number stored in his contacts like a lifeline he was too afraid to grab, and he realized with stunning clarity that he had become exactly the kind of man he had despised as a child, someone who let fear and social expectations override the very connections that made life worth living. The foundation work that had once felt like honoring Keisha's memory now felt like a hollow substitute for the real human connection his sister would have wanted him to find, the love and family and authentic relationships that she had always believed were more important than any amount of money or professional success. As he stood there surrounded by luxury but starving for meaning, Damon Wellington made a choice that would have terrified the board members and lawyers and PR specialists who had spent the day protecting his image. He picked up his phone and began dialing Lucia's number, his hands trembling with the knowledge that this call would either save his soul or destroy everything he had spent his adult life building. 3 hours later, as Lucia sat in her modest Miami hotel room reviewing Dr. Harrison's treatment plan for Sophia and trying to process the surreal turns her life had taken in just 2 days, her phone rang with a number she had memorized but never expected to see again. For a moment she simply stared at the screen, afraid that answering would lead to more pain, more disappointment, more evidence that fairy tales didn't happen to women like her. But something in the desperate way it continued ringing, something in the late hour and the implications of what it meant for him to be calling despite all his lawyer's warnings, made her press the accept button with a trembling finger. "Lucia," his voice came through the speaker rough with emotion and exhaustion, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to me completely before you hang up, because what I'm about to say is going to sound insane and impulsive and completely contrary to everything that happened this morning." She could hear the desperation in his voice, could picture him pacing in that sterile apartment or his corporate office, and despite everything that had passed between them, despite the pain of his rejection and the public humiliation of the video scandal, she found herself holding her breath and waiting for his words. "I love you," he continued, the admission coming out in a rush as if he was afraid he would lose his courage if he didn't speak quickly. "I know that sounds impossible. I know we've only known each other for 2 days. I know that everything about our situation is complicated and difficult and probably doomed to failure. But Lucia, I love the way you fight for Sophia with a fierceness that puts my corporate battles to shame. I love the way you find strength in moments when anyone else would break. I love the way you made me remember what it feels like to care about something more than stock prices and board meetings and maintaining the perfect public image." Each word hit her like a physical blow, not because they hurt but because they confirmed what she had been afraid to believe, that their connection had been real, that the man who had held her so tenderly had been fighting the same battle between love and fear that had been tearing her apart all day. "This morning I chose safety over love, chose my career over my heart, chose the expectations of other people over the voice of my own soul, and I've spent every hour since then feeling like I was dying from the inside out. I can't live with that choice, Lucia. I can't go back to being the empty, isolated man I was before you slapped me on that airplane and forced me to feel something real again." The vulnerability in his confession was staggering, the admission of a man who was risking everything on the possibility that love might be worth more than safety, and as Lucia listened to him pour out his heart across the miles that separated them, she felt her own carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble once again. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning in Chicago, Lucia stood in the doorway of Sophia's hospital room watching her 8-year-old daughter carefully arrange a collection of astronaut figurines on her bedside table, her movements deliberate and precise despite the 4-line trailing from her small arm. The experimental treatment in Miami had been everything Dr. Harrison had promised and more. Sophia's cancer markers had dropped to undetectable levels. Her energy had returned in waves that reminded Lucia of the vibrant little girl she had been before leukemia invaded their lives, and most importantly, her daughter's eyes had regained that spark of mischief and wonder that had dimmed during the darkest months of their battle. "Mama," Sophia said without looking up from her astronaut arrangement, "when Mr. Damon comes today, can we show him the pictures from the Space Center?" The question was asked with the casual confidence of a child who had grown accustomed to having two adults who loved her unconditionally, who had somehow managed to navigate the complex waters of public scrutiny, media attention, and corporate politics to build something beautiful and lasting from the chaos that had brought them together. Lucia smiled as she adjusted the colorful scarf that covered Sophia's head where her hair was slowly growing back in soft, dark curls, remembering the day 3 months ago when Damon had surprised them both by arranging a private tour of NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, watching Sophia's face light up as she met real astronauts and touched pieces of spacecraft that had traveled to the moon. "Of course, Mija," she replied, settling into the chair beside the bed that had become her second home during Sophia's treatment cycles. "He loves hearing about your space adventures almost as much as you love telling them." The relationship between Damon and Sophia had developed with an ease that still amazed Lucia. He had never tried to replace Carlos in Sophia's memory, but had instead carved out his own space in her daughter's heart through bedtime stories about brave astronauts, elaborate games involving space missions to save imaginary planets, and a patience with her questions about rockets and stars and galaxies that seemed infinite. The transformation in Damon himself had been equally remarkable to witness, though it had come at a cost that would have terrified the man he used to be. His decision to publicly embrace their relationship had triggered exactly the kind of corporate upheaval his advisors had predicted. 3 board members had demanded his resignation. 2 major investors had pulled their funding, and the media scrutiny had been relentless for months as reporters dissected every aspect of their unconventional love story. But instead of destroying him, the crisis had revealed reserves of strength and authenticity that years of corporate success had buried under layers of careful image management and calculated decisions. He had fought for his position as CEO with a passion that reminded everyone why he had been successful in the first place, arguing that his personal happiness made him a better leader, that his commitment to Lucia and Sophia demonstrated the kind of values the company should embrace rather than fear. The battle had been ugly and public and exhausting, but when the dust settled, Damon had emerged not weakened but stronger, leading a company that was more profitable and more respected than ever before, surrounded by board members and employees who had learned to trust his judgment even when it defied conventional wisdom. The foundation had flourished under his more hands-on leadership, with Lucia serving as an unofficial advisor who helped him understand the real-world impact of their policies and procedures on families facing medical crises. Together, they had redesigned the application process to be more accessible, had established emergency funding protocols for time-sensitive cases, and had created support programs that addressed not just medical costs but the emotional and practical challenges that came with childhood illness. "He's changed everything," Dr. Martinez at Chicago Children's Hospital had told Lucia during one of Sophia's recent checkups. "Not just the foundation, but the way all of us think about patient advocacy and family support. Having someone who understands both the business side and the human side, who's lived through this experience with you and Sophia, It's made all the difference for families who come after you. When a small telescope he had promised to bring Sophia so she could better observe the constellations she had been studying, Lucia felt the same flutter of joy and recognition that had surprised her every day for the past 6 months. He moved through the hospital corridors with the easy confidence of someone who belonged there, greeting nurses by name and stopping to chat with other families he had met during Sophia's treatment journey, but his face always transformed when he reached their room, softening with a love so obvious that even the most skeptical medical staff had been won over by its authenticity. "My 2 favorite girls," he said, setting down the telescope case and moving to kiss Lucia's forehead before turning to Sophia with the kind of focused attention that made her feel like the most important person in the world. "I heard from a little bird that someone aced her math test yesterday and earned a special telescope demonstration." Sophia's giggle filled the room like music, and as Lucia watched Damon carefully unpack the telescope while explaining how different lenses could bring distant stars into focus, she marveled at how naturally he had stepped into their lives, how seamlessly he had woven himself into the fabric of their daily existence without ever trying to erase the memory of Carlos or claim a role that wasn't authentically his. The 3 of them had developed their own rhythms and traditions, Sunday morning pancakes in Damon's renovated penthouse that now felt like a home rather than a showpiece, elaborate art projects that covered every surface of his once pristine dining table, bedtime stories that Sophia insisted required voices for all the different alien characters in her favorite space adventure books. "Mama," Sophia said as Damon adjusted the telescope's focus, "when I become an astronaut and go to Mars, will you and Mr. Damon come visit me there?" The question was asked with the matter-of-fact confidence of a child who had never doubted that her dreams were achievable, whose recovery had been so complete that she was already planning adventures that stretched decades into the future. "We'll be the first tourists to Mars," Damon promised solemnly, his voice carrying the same conviction he used in board meetings when announcing ambitious corporate goals. "Your mama and I will be there cheering when you plant the first flag and name the first Martian mountain after whatever you want." The easy way he included himself in Sophia's long-term future, the assumption that they would all still be together for whatever adventures lay ahead, made Lucia's chest tight with emotions that were still sometimes too large for her heart to contain. As evening painted the hospital room in shades of gold and amber, as Sophia drifted off to sleep with the telescope positioned near her window so she could see it first thing in the morning, Lucia and Damon found themselves standing together in the hallway outside her room, sharing the quiet intimacy that had become their trademark. Stolen moments of connection in the midst of busy lives dedicated to Sophia's healing and the Foundation's growing impact. "She asked me something today that I haven't been able to stop thinking about," Lucia said, her voice soft so as not to wake the other children on the ward. "She wanted to know if you were going to marry me, and when I asked why she was thinking about that, she said it was because Carlos visits her in dreams sometimes and he told her that he likes you, that he thinks you take good care of us the way he would want someone to." The words hung between them like a bridge spanning past and future, honoring the love that had created Sophia while acknowledging the love that was shaping her recovery and their shared tomorrows. Damon was quiet for a long moment, his hand finding hers with the automatic ease of 6 months spent learning each other's moods and needs and unspoken languages. "What did you tell her?" he asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer, already understood the careful balance Lucia maintained between honoring Sophia's father and embracing the possibilities of their present love. "I told her that grown-up decisions are complicated, but that love is simple," Lucia replied, turning to face him fully, seeing in his expression the same mixture of hope and vulnerability that had characterized their relationship from that first desperate slap on an airplane. "I told her that when people love each other the way we love each other, They find ways to build lives together that honor everyone they've loved before while creating space for new kinds of happiness. The conversation had the weight of a proposal and an acceptance all wrapped into one, a recognition that they had moved beyond the crisis that brought them together into something permanent and beautiful and worth fighting for despite all the obstacles that remained. "Then I guess the only question left," Damon said, reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw a small velvet box that made Lucia's breath catch in her throat, "is whether you're ready to make it official, to let the whole world know that sometimes love finds you in the most impossible circumstances and transforms everything you thought you knew about what your life could be." The ring inside was perfect, not ostentatious or designed to impress others, but elegant and timeless and exactly what she would have chosen if she had dared to dream of such things during those dark months when survival was the only goal that mattered. As she looked at the man who had started as a stranger, she struck in anger and become the love she never expected to find again. As she thought about Sophia sleeping peacefully in a hospital room instead of fighting for each breath, as she considered the foundation that was helping hundreds of families avoid the desperation that had once driven her to violence, Lucia felt the last pieces of her carefully guarded heart finally surrender to the impossible possibility that fairy tales could happen. To people like her, that love could indeed conquer not just death and disease and poverty, but fear and cynicism and the voice that whispered that happiness was always temporary, always conditional, always one crisis away from disappearing forever. "Yes," she whispered. And then louder, with the fierce confidence of a woman who had learned to fight for everything she loved. "Yes, Damon Wellington, I will marry you, and together we will give Sophia the family she deserves and love each other the way Carlos would want me to be loved and Keisha would want you to love." The kiss that followed tasted like promises kept and dreams fulfilled, and the kind of love that transforms not just two people but everyone whose lives they touch. And as they held each other in the hallway of a children's hospital where miracles happened every day, both of them knew that their story, which had begun with an act of desperate violence 30,000 feet above the earth, had become something beautiful enough to last forever.